glad you're finally here. We want to talk about the Nation Building Fund and the management of that. When you answer the first question, just give your name and your position at that time, because I don't think you're there now, so that the records will show what your position is. I guess I'll start off very generic by asking, what was your role, if any, in the management and administration of the Nation Building Fund? You got the little button on the back of it. The green light should come on. We're very antiquated here when it comes to mics and sound system.
Okay, so on now?
No, I don't think so. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. You
Yes.
also got to speak right into it,
Speak right into it. Okay.
as if you're singing a soul song.
Yeah, you wouldn't want me to do that in here. Mr. Chairman, thank you and members for having me. I can't tell you it's exactly a pleasure to be here, but I appreciate the opportunity, particularly given the history of this particular matter. My post, when last employed by the government, previous to my retirement on June 4th, 2013, was Chief of Staff in the Office of the Premier. After a long career in the civil service, which most of you have some familiarity with. I won't try to answer your question, Mr. Chairman, about my role, and I'll tell you why. I find it very difficult to think of answering questions on this report, given the nature of the beast. I find myself presented in this report being, to use the language of criminal justice, convicted of all sorts of wrongdoing, not having been given any opportunity to speak to the matter, particularly given that this is supposed to be an audit. Now, my understanding of an audit in the government sector is that upon commencing the audit, the auditor would approach the principals concerned, make them aware of what was going on, request documentation, access to records and such, give them an opportunity to do what due diligence, and subsequently the findings would be reported to them, and they will be given an opportunity to speak to the matter, speak to those findings as manager responsible. In this particular instance, none of that was done. What was done instead was that, for some reason, the choice was made to approach the Deputy Governor for authorization to carry out the audit, as it says in the report itself. And then an exercise carried out to establish a number of things, including the terms of the audit, the criteria by which transfer payment ought to be judged, and so on, all of which, frankly, is very much, just as much ultra vires as anything that is charged in this report, because you can't possibly expect to construct a set of criteria, a set of standards at one point, and go back into practice and say, well, you failed to carry out these standards. Particularly when, as in this case, the transfer payment system was operated on the basis that ministers were understood to have wide ambit to participate in the decision-making process as far as distribution of those payments are concerned. That was the reference is made in this report to the culture of the day. That was part of the culture, because the public management finance law did not detail the nature of how transfer payments were to be made. Only now are instructions being given to determine standards by which transfer payments should be handled.
But in I admit that you have wide experience in the civil service. In your previous experience and other roles in the civil service, as high as they used to be called, permanent secretaries at that time, I believe an assistant permanent secretary. Was it the case that that kind of latitude and involvement was allowed by ministers in the decision-making and allocation of funding?
With all due respect, sir, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves in the sense that the report alleges all sorts of things about the involvement of the minister at the time. It chooses, for some reason, to refer to the former premier and his chief of staff. Mentions me specifically as chief of staff 9 times as having done X, Y, and Z outside the law. Mentions him specifically 12 times. That has yet to be proven as far as I'm concerned. This is a bundle of allegations based on claims that records did not exist when the records were there to be examined. I don't know where to begin in telling you how wrong this is and how wronged I feel at this point in time. I came here this afternoon, with all respect, with the highest of respect for members of this committee, because you have a very serious job to do, and I have every respect for that job, with the intention of not answering any questions, because this report does not deserve that kind of treatment. Right? And to say instead that the only fair way to proceed with this would be to give me an opportunity to say something about this report that would correct the record to some extent, because this is so wrong that I don't know where to begin. All I know is that my reputation at this point is being dragged all over the place on the basis of allegations made and without me being given an opportunity to say anything. Now, something is very wrong. If we're going to endorse that kind of action, something is very wrong in this country.
Well, given what you feel about the report, and your statement that records exist that you do not believe were accessed based on what is said in the report.
Yes, sir.
Can you tell this committee how, in your view, those records contradict what is in this report and how those records comply with the provisions of the PMFL law?
Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the better examples is the scholarship program. The claim is made that myself and the former premier essentially handpicked people to give the money to and gave them as much money as we wanted to give to them without any application process, without any documentation, without any accountability for the distribution of the money. And that is as far from the truth as I can make it. Every person who got a scholarship had to apply, and granted, in the first instance, the application process was somewhat rudimentary, but they had to write letters of application. Those letters of application were sometimes received directly by the premier. When you start to talk about a program like this, people get excited. They think my child can get a chance to go and get an education, and they will write to anybody they think that they can think about to get access. So they wrote to him. To the best of my knowledge, his letters were passed on to the members of staff. Contrary to the report's findings, there were members of staff assigned to review these things. I was involved directly in it myself in looking at the applications, examining whether they had funding elsewhere, examining whether they had the capability to take on a scholarship, looking at their letters of acceptance as to what kind of school this was, whether it was a school worthy of giving somebody a scholarship to, checking on all these things, checking whether they had any other scholarships, etc. All of this, the report claims, did not exist, was not done. Okay? When applicants were approved, they were given their scholarships on the basis that they were required to authorize the school to report back to the office of the premier on a regular basis as to what their grade achievements were. That if they didn't keep up the scratch, that was reviewed every time it came in. if they didn't keep up to scratch, they were in danger of either being put on probation or having their scholarships cancelled altogether. And there were a couple of instances where they went into that unfortunate situation. All of this is on file. I was told subsequently by one of the accounting members of staff that the Auditor General staff, upon approach, were offered access to the documentation that was available and were told, oh, we don't need all of that. And I can't tell you that is true, but what I can tell you is that I saw and handled these kinds of documents myself. I saw the process working. I was intimately involved in the process. I know for a fact that this is how it went because I interviewed these students, many of them myself personally. And this was, as far as rigorous as we could make it at the time, given the short staff that we had to operate with. And that is another story which you want me to start on. The fact that the Deputy Governor can come here and talk about the fact that this kind of thing won't happen again in the future because the person responsible is no longer in the service. Good for him, because I was a thorn in his flesh. I was a thorn in his flesh because I was not one of the yes men, okay? I questioned things, I required answers for things, I wanted explanations for things, and I put it to them, all of my colleagues. The job that we were there to do was a job that we were not doing. We ought to be working across ministries, we ought to be pulling the government together, that the only way we're going to save in the long run, the only way we're going to achieve levels of governance that were suitable to this country in the long run was if we pull together every ministry. They looked at me in the Deputy Governor's office, in the Deputy Governor's meeting, and say, oh yes, we will do that. They have yet to attempt such a thing in either one of those meetings. And I went there, and I went there, and I listened, and I tried to contribute, and eventually I got sick of it, okay? And the history of my interaction with that office, you wouldn't want to hear in this chamber this afternoon.
So if the committee asks the current people in the ministry to supply us with the documentation that you say exists, these agreements with the scholarship holders, their commitment to maintain their grades, you're telling us that those records exist and we can get access to them?
I would think so, sir.
Okay.
But as I said before, with all due respect to yourself and the members of the committee, I would really find it very difficult to sit here and go through a question session based on this document. It has blown my dignity to do that because this document has insulted me roundly, okay? You have no idea what I had to live with for the last 7 months with this thing hanging over my head. After 25 years of service to the government where my integrity never came into question.
Well, I mean, if you look at the back of the report, the government has accepted most of the recommendations.
I'm aware.
So I don't know if you, maybe I can help the committee by asking some important, some questions, and if you don't have the information, that's would be acceptable at this point in time. But for instance, the National Building Program sample sizes and responses, church number of samples 15, responses received 15, percentage of samples of total payments, sample amount 4.7 million, total program payments 5 million. Others 17 samples, 14 responses, 66% of the total payments. Sample amount 2.9 million, total program 4.4 million. Young Nation Buildings, NYBP, 26 samples, responses received 25, 37%, 1.4 million the value of the samples pulled, total program 3.8 million. Are you saying that this kind of evidence presented to the committee is wrong?
What I'm saying to you, sir, is that there was a sampling done, as I understand it, and that the report purports to present the outcome of that sampling exercise. What I find difficult is that the information gleaned from those sampled, the way that that has been treated, because the numbers don't tell the whole story, in the sense that if you get 25 out of 26, it's not just a question of how many responses you get, it's a question of what you then say about those responses. That 26, in this case, goes back to that scholarship program. And what I'm saying to you, sir, is that of those 26 responses, there's a set of numbers that came out of that. But what also came out of that is an assertion in the report that there was no application process, blah, 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 blah. And in fact, none of that is true. So the difficulty I have is that in order to respond to this report appropriately, you would have to go through line by line. That is how bad it is, okay? Line by line. And I'm sure the committee doesn't have time for that. I certainly don't have the inclination for it either. The only answer to this is to reject this and start again. That's my position.
But I don't think...
I'm not, sorry, sir, but I have no difficulty being audited, no. But don't do this kind of exercise.
Okay, so you don't disagree that the sampling size, 94%, 66%, 37% is unrealistic in an audit?
Yeah, that's, no, well, I hadn't given thought to the validity of the sample size per se, because I couldn't get past the actual conclusions that were being drawn from the material that was extracted. And as long as the sample size is reasonable, yes, by all means, come to some conclusions about what you see. But how you could look at a sample of 26 students and none of them would tell you that they had to go through an application process. None of them would tell you that they had to sign a bond. None of them would tell you any of these things that applied. I find it very difficult to believe that. Very difficult.
And you're saying that from your perspective, all the students signed bond, and that bond included a commitment to maintain grade point average.
Yes.
And that they were going to schools that were reputable.
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, through you to Mr. Dilbert, in terms of the overall report, I won't delve into too many specifics, but when you're reading this report and you see, especially in the conclusion, that the Auditor General found that some $13.2 million were not effectively managed, and that, you know, when they spoke about things like the scholarships and incidents with you know, payments being made to loan companies in the U.S., payments being made, or problems with some of the schools that some of the people had gone to, and then the kind of discuss, you know, children of senior government officials were receiving amounts over the $25,000 maximum. Those are the things that I'm kind of interested in that, what the checks and balances, like, you know, what was the most an applicant received? Were there incidents where people with less GPAs than the education scholarship GPA requirement were being paid, and how much were they being paid, and what kind of schools were they going to? You know, and you've said that there was a formality in place, because the report said that for the first 2 years of the scholarship program, there were no there was no formalization of the process, and so it's those things that I want to or ask you, in that if you don't agree with those findings, then I mean you can state it for the record. But those are the concerns that, as a member of the Public Accounts Committee, hearing those types of figures, hearing those you know, or seeing those words in these reports, is trying to find out kind of how what the system was. How come it seems, based on this report, that there were little or no checks and balances, especially in the kind of scholarship criteria. If you're looking at amounts being paid that were more than the actual scholarship criteria that was in place, I guess, for the Education Ministry, and then some of the other things that are alarming when you read them are the things like money is going to private gyms that weren't used, money is going to pay off budget shortfalls in terms of the ICO, CCTV program, the water authority.
Sorry, sir. We're in danger of getting so muddled in detail that I won't be able to answer you. I'm sorry, but I have to stop at some point. If I'm going to answer at all, I can't answer a litany of 15 different things because I won't remember what you're talking about.
But I was just giving you examples of the kind of the report, right? And I'm sure you've read the report. So
Yep.
I'm just saying whether or not you agree that with the finding that these things were not in line with other programs at the time in government with checks and balances.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Connolly, for the question. But can I say that maybe I should have just read my deposition because that would have responded to a lot of this in advance. But let's start perhaps at the back and go back to your beginning. That's the one that freshes my mind. I think you mentioned the ICO and a couple of other entities. There's a specific category of the report that speaks about subverting government authorization in dealing with expenditure by other agencies. And that's where the ICO is mentioned, internal external affairs is mentioned, and water authority is mentioned, and I think a couple others. In those cases, there was no subversion of government authority. Those cases arose in a particular context. They arose in the context of the UK government exerting micromanagement control over the budget. Now, I don't know whether members present will cast their mind back to those particular days, but that was always happening at that point. They felt that we were so far out of our margins in the budget that they were going to exert direct control over approving exactly how the budget went. And one of the stipulations was that no supplementary expenditure was going to be entertained. In that context, the ICO had an urgent need to pay lawyers because they had an extended legal case through a judicial review issue, and the legal bills mounted up. The cabinet met and considered that the only way that it could find money to assist the ICO in paying these legal bills, given the restriction on no supplementaries, was to find it in something like a transfer payment. And the Premier offered that amount, I believe. I don't know how the details of the cabinet discussion went, but essentially that was the background. Once cabinet cleared the submission to be made to the Assembly was then informed of the circumstances and approved the funds. I don't know how you can possibly describe that as subverting government authority. The same thing happened, as far as I am aware, with the internal external affairs matter, which was to pay for extraordinary expenses for the CCTV program. And the same thing happened with the water authority, which was trying to respond to an emergency flooding situation in Randike Gardens. Now, we can talk all we want about whether it's appropriate for government to intervene in that sort of situation in the first place. But that is not my business at this point in time. My business is to respond to the charge that we subverted government authority. And to say to you that, to the best of my knowledge, in each one of these instances, submissions were made to Cabinet. Cabinet cleared it. It came to the Finance Committee. Finance Committee approved the variance in the budget.
Well, I don't recall us ever having a finance committee other than budget in the last, since 2009 when I've been here. So what period during this time, FS, maybe you can help me, that we have a finance committee that I'm not aware of and I didn't attend?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, definitely and be stating the obvious, the Finance Committee met to consider the annual budget approval process.
That's the only time.
I don't recall during the period of 2009 to 2012 that beyond, apart from those annual approval processes that the committee met to consider supplementary appropriations. And in fact, I think when the current government came in into May 2013, at the beginning of that term, there were a number of supplementary appropriation bills relating to past years prior to that. But I think what Mr. Dilbert is the point that he's making is that they were very dire circumstances. I mean, he's articulated it very well. They were very dire circumstances which required action. I mean, I do recall in quite vividly the situation in the Randike Garden situation, and we were told that, listen, this is a, kind of untasteful to speak about it. This is a situation where you have raw sewerage on the ground, and if you don't address it, it's a national disaster,
But-
and so forth. So,
Isn't there a process by which Cabinet wires funds
Yes, sir.
from one subhead to another,
Right.
and that it would not have been done from the Nation Building Fund? It would have been done from the specific subhead in government that would have dealt with that kind of disaster. Wouldn't that be the proper legal requirement of the PMFL law to follow?
Mr. Chairman, you are right in that there is a procedure in the PMFL to allow transfers to take place. And specifically, this would have been done most likely under using the authority under Section 11, subsection 5 in the PMFL law, that basically allows the government, and there is a monetary limit, there is a monetary extent to which those movements can take place. I think it's up to 5% of the budgeted revenue for that particular fiscal year. And there is generally, Mr. Chairman, there is generally, in these circumstances, quite difficult, not so much a concern about, where necessarily the monies are coming from and going to. If it's an operating expenditure, items involved, the focus and the emphasis is to make sure that the funds come from an operating expense item going to an operating expense item and not crossing the line of operating and capital expenditures. So the movements, I believe, Mr. Chair and committee, coming out of the Nation Building Fund to finance these other items that we've just spoken about would have been most likely, I'm using most likely because I can't be 100% certain, would have been most likely done under the Section 11.5 process under the PMFL.
But
So the cabinet, the cabinet would have most likely granted authority for those movements to take place, and all Section 11.5 transactions then find themselves being placed in a supplementary appropriation bill. Oftentimes, the supplementary appropriation bill doesn't get presented to the Parliament and the Legislative Assembly until that fiscal year has passed and much more time has passed beyond that.
But I would hazard a guess that that's not the intention of the PMFL law, because it says it should be reported ASAP, or as soon as possible, or practicable. But the question I have is that when the government and cabinet decides to move money from subhead A to subhead B, the money go for a particular expenditure of subhead B, the money goes to subhead B and is dispensed from that. it is not dispensed from subhead A on that person's, on that entity behalf.
Could I?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that is how it's to be
Supposed to
done.
work, yeah.
One budget is reduced, another budget is increased,
Right.
and the payment would essentially be made from the budget that has been increased.
But my understanding, Mr. Chairman, is that in this instance, what occurred was the movement of the funds from the Nation Building Fund to these other entities, as you suggest. That was my understanding. I distinctly recall Section 11.5 being cited to Cabinet as the authorization under which this variance could take place.
But then my question is how did the money come out of the Nation Building Fund and go directly to the entity as opposed to the subhead to which that entity would normally be paid for?
I can't answer the technicalities of how the transfer took place because
my experience in government says that that's what is done. And in order to keep the accounting and the auditing and everything separate and to follow the strict guidelines of the PMFL, that is what is necessary to be done. Because if it goes directly from the Nation Building Fund to that entity, then there is no record that that entity spent the money. And therefore it can't be accounted for properly in accordance with the PMFL law. And my understanding is that that's not what happened because of the gravity of the situation or the urgency of the situation, but my job is to find out why the right thing didn't happen.
And in this instance, my additional job, apart from helping to clarify what happened, is to question the validity of charges like subverting government authority. Because
Well, you might argue with the phraseology.
I do.
But if the government law, if the PMFL law requires Cabinet to transfer money under 511 from one subhead to another subhead to be dispensed by that subhead, if that's not what happened, then you're breaking the law. You're subverting the law.
Yes, sir. I granted. The difficulty I have is that not having been involved in the audit, as ought to have been the case, I don't know that that is behind what is being said. All I know is that this large charge is levied without any evidence as to what the basis for it is. Right? The talk is up here, but what the details are that inform that are unknown to me.
But you would agree that it is not, and we have a professional auditor here. My experience, and I worked on a very peripheral audit firm, but I don't think the auditors spent too much time interviewing the person as reviewing the documentation that was produced for that transaction, because that is what they have to use. In an interview you can say anything, but if the documentation says A, B, and C, you might give the person who produced that documentation, and I think that was done here, by sending it to management to ask for their response to their findings. Am I wrong, Mr. Roy?
Mr. Chairman, I think you are, in general terms, describing the process that would generally be followed. When you look at the documentation, examine it, then determine if there are any information missing that or clarification that you need in order to interpret or understand the information that you have been given or provided with.
One question again arising there is the question of going to management with it, because I question the authority of that management to be the body to be approached about the matter. I don't see what position they have in relation to this matter. They had no responsibility for this matter. The person
But maybe
who
I can let
the person who ought to have been approached was me.
maybe I can let the Auditor General, because as I understand it, in most of these audits, you go to the same person to get the same agreement. This is not an unusual position in terms of going to the Deputy Governor to agree to what they're going to audit and how it's going to be done. That's not unique. Am I correct in saying that that's not unique to this report?
That's correct, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair,
Take us through the process briefly.
when we finish our report, we send our report to the Deputy Governor as the coordinator for the response to our audit. It's his responsibility to get from officials any information he needs to respond, which he did in this case, and provide us any comments and the responses to the recommendations. That process is followed on every audit, and it was followed on this audit.
This might be an appropriate time for me to suggest, Mr. Chairman, that there is a breakdown, a serious breakdown occurred somewhere, in that upon becoming aware of this report last August, I immediately wrote to the Deputy Governor to say to him, I trust you are aware of the fact that being the officer responsible for this, I have not been approached at all in the course of this audit. I had no opportunity to do anything, to contribute anything to this at all. And I'm extremely concerned about this. In my view, it ought not to proceed from here until we rectify the situation. And his response to me was that it's in the hands of the Auditor General. I responded to him further by saying that, well, my understanding is that he's now presented it to you. So I think that you have very much have to do with it. So what are we going to do with this? And there was no further answer to that.
Mr. Rubin, you wanted to say something further?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In clearing the report, we are aware that Mr. Dilbert did write to the Deputy Governor about some concerns, and in fact, at the time, additional time was provided for evidence to be provided to support any kind of discussion or any kind of information that we needed in order to change the report to correct the facts in the report or to correct any of the information that we, in fact, that we put in the report. The fact of the matter was that we did not receive any additional information during that time frame, and eventually, after several weeks of waiting, we did not, since we did not get any, we agreed with the Deputy Governor that it was time to issue the report.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask, please, can we clarify exactly who was made aware of this additional time being given? Because it certainly wasn't drawn to my attention. At no point has any invitation come to me prior to the one from the PSC to have anything to say about this report. So you can take those two assertions for what they're worth, but I'm telling you, this is my first opportunity to have anything to say about this.
Okay, you had follow up on the scholarship thing? Or?
Mr. Chairman, just through you again, you know, in terms of the of I guess advising whether or not there were any issues with the scholarships in terms of the schooling, some of the schools that the individuals went to, and also just detailing the highest amount that was awarded to a scholarship recipient under the Nation Building Fund.
I recall one specific instance of a particular institution being called into question because the students departed for school, spent, I think, a single term, if my memory serves, and the school apparently went into bankruptcy or something, had some extreme financial difficulties, and had to close up shop. And the students then had to find alternative places to attend. But how that could be foreseen, I don't know. But that's the only instance I can.
What was the criteria that you used as one of the persons reviewing the application in the school they were going to? Did you require similar requirements like the that the Education Council, which you would have been aware from your past experience?
That was a detail that I didn't attend to personally, but it was the task of the staff who were doing it to look at similar measures. That was their understanding, that they would essentially use the Education Council approach as a sort of template for reviewing the information about the schools as to whether they were viable institutions or not, or institutions that were worthy of sending a student to, whether they would deliver the kind of education that you were hoping for. And coming back to Mr. Connolly's question about the highest amount, I think the report cites an amount of 66,000, and that accords with my memory of the highest amount. The approach taken in this scholarship scheme was basically that a ceiling of 25,000 would be the norm. But if there was an exceptional case of a particular course of study that called for a higher tuition, had higher costs, and it seemed to be warranted given the promise that the student had, etc., then an exception might be made to allow that to happen. And that happened on a few occasions. But if that is itself a wrong approach, then that would be one of the mistakes made in the course of operating the program that we should learn from. But the thinking in the setting up of the scholarship was that the existing scholarships were sufficiently rigid and inflexible and uncompromising in their approach that there were quite a few students who were eligible for further education, had the promise of making good of further education, but had no way in, had no basis of support.
I guess my question would be why wasn't the same approach taken with scholarships that was taken with the Water Authority? In other words, and money was transferred from the Nation Building Fund to the Scholarship Secretariat, and we stuck to one criteria. Because we can't on the one hand claim that things were so bad that we didn't have any money to spend, but on the other hand, we were spending it outside of established criteria by known entities and well-established entities in government.
Well, that in part is really asking me to question whether the government policy of the day was appropriate or not, because that was not my policy. I tried to work with the policy and to keep things operating in as efficient a manner as possible. But the policy was derived from the policy-making source on the basis that those existing schemes excluded too many people, and there ought to be a way of reaching them. So that was the justification.
And the reason why I asked, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The reason why I asked that was the commentary again on page 9, paragraph 38, right, where the Auditor General cited a lack of open, fair, and transparent application with no internal controls. And I know you've stated what you've stated before, but in terms of in line with what the chairman just said, there were other programs at the time, I guess, that were also within government policy, etc. And to be able to, I guess, justify why certain people that may not have had grade point averages, that may have had in the viewpoint of someone in the Premier's office, the aptitude or the ability to justify some, in that instance that would have been more than 3 times the amount of the education scholarship, and that's the part that I'm kind of just looking at, like what criteria was being used at the time to justify these variances, because there were certain established kind of parameters in other programs, and this seems so out of whack. Like, I mean, something that's 3 times as much is a lot. And then, you know, when you have, again, allegations saying that, you know, some of of these amounts were going to senior government officials and things like that. That's where, when you read this report on its face, it's alarming. So I'm trying to connect the dots and give you the opportunity to even if there wasn't a kind of written policy or what just ballpark, what were the kind of the purpose of the Nation Building Fund and how some of these decisions were being made, because that's what I'm trying to get my head around.
Well, Mr. Chairman, as I indicated just previously, the thinking I gathered behind the implementation of this scholarship fund was to address shortfalls in the existing scholarships that were, according to the policymakers, too rigid and not reaching a whole slew of young people who might make good of an educational opportunity, an opportunity for higher education. And while it is true that the 66,000 is an extreme amount, I think it's interesting to look at the question of how often those kinds of exceptions occurred. It would also be interesting to know, which the report makes no attempt to do, even though it condemns the whole use of 13.2 million by the Nation Building Fund as of being of no benefit to the Cayman Islands, that it would be interesting to know what the outcome of those scholarships were. How many of those young people did succeed? Where are they now? What are they doing? Are they contributing or not? Was there any value resulting from that or not? Now, I don't know how far an audit would be expected to go in that regard, but it seems to me that it should at least leave an opening for the possibility that that added value should be recognized, and not come to the conclusion that there was no value to the people of the Cayman Islands on the face of it. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Connolly also previously made mention of, I think, the West Bay Gym. And there was a specific mention of that in the report. The actual description is not correct in that it was not a privately owned building on West Bay Road. It was a government-owned building in West Bay proper. There was an expenditure to planning for certain fees that were incurred in that respect, because it was a project that the applicant wished to implement to try to appeal to some of the young men in West Bay to, as they say, get them out of trouble or keep them out of trouble. The project broke down in the end because the applicant couldn't negotiate a suitable contract with a contractor to do the fit out of the building and so on. So it was abandoned, and that was the end of the expenditure. Again, contextually, the justification for that consideration being that at the time, there was a lot of activity in terms of conflicts between armed gangs and all this kind of thing, and it was added particular poignancy to the need to do something about intervening with young men. So that influenced the decision making at the time about trying to facilitate this innovation. So that's true, Mr. Chairman, to Mr. Connolly. That's what I can say about that, sir.
You were asking about the frequency of which the 25,000 was exceeded. The report evidence shows 4 to 2 times that they exceeded the 25,000 limit for government scholarships. Oh, the limit for the limit for the Nation Building Fund itself was higher than the government academic scholarships? Oh, okay. And you said that 25,000 was the policy position of the minister. That was not something that you and the technocrats developed in order to give out scholarships within the ministry under the Nation Building Fund as a criteria.
I wouldn't say that the technocrats were not involved at all, because the context I was trying to reach for earlier was one in which a partly accepted way of proceeding when it came to managing transfer payments was to engage with ministers as to how they saw the lay of the land. And in that sense, there was input from him in this case, as there was input from the technocrats. The idea being that while you wanted to be open and more flexible, and recognizing that quite a few of the candidates we were seeing were persons from less endowed backgrounds, shall we say, that you ought not to go outrageously beyond what the Education Council was doing, that there ought to be some reasonable relationship between the two, as opposed to essentially having a carte blanche situation, giving everybody all the money that they say they needed. But all of that detail of how the program worked is only comprehensible in a way if you go back into the context in which the whole program operated, and give some cognizance to the fact that policymakers were responding to a situation of, as I said before, apparent lack of reach of existing scholarship programs, and the fact that there were too many young people who were being failed, not having an opportunity.
But given your background, your experience, did you advise the minister, would you consider that the answer to that was to correct the shortcomings of the government already existing scholarship program, as opposed to supplementing it above and beyond that program?
That kind of advice naturally gets raised in those discussions, and you will know from your own experience as a minister that when a policy initiative comes up, you beat it all around and try to come up with the best solution. You will also know, I believe, Mr. Chairman, that there are entities within the public sector that have deep roots and are very difficult to budge, very difficult to influence. And while advising the minister about the possible viability of amending existing programs, making them more flexible, funding them to a large extent, etc., it has to be recognized that if the response to that is that, well, how are you going to really budge these people? Because this is how they do it, and this is how they've always done it. You will never get them to change. And it's a difficult argument to counter, because it is very much a part of the civil service culture that there are established interests. Good afternoon, Mr. Rubin. There are established interests that are de facto. You deal with them as best you can.
Any other questions?
Again, Mr. Chairman, through you, in terms of, again, just the process, right? And we see on page 18, number 73, where some of the payments went straight to parents for things outside of the norm, so like lodging, books, travel, and other expenses. When we're looking at this in its totality, it's there seem to have been a lot of deviations from accepted norms, right? And I understand, trying to give people second chances or alternate chances
First chances.
or first chances. Well, the first chance would have been the education scholarship. What I mean is that they were either not being accommodated under that for a particular reason, right? And so they were getting a second chance through the Nation Building Fund. That's what I meant by that. There has to be some, I guess, in my mind, to justify some sort of written criteria, some sort of at least side notes somewhere. And you said there are records somewhere that we may have not seen. There should have been some notations saying, well, okay, here's the Nation Building Scholarship. Here's what it was, but for these justifiable reasons, we're deviating. And to do it 42 or to have it done 42 times, to have some anomalies where checks were being paid in 75 to the loan company, the checks were being paid to parents, etc. Though from an audit perspective, you would expect that there are at least notations somewhere on the file.
Mr. Chairman, the instances that I can recall that would have been pertinent to this payment to parents and so on would have been instances where the applicant was not yet of the age of 18 and was otherwise able to take up the scholarship, etc., but the agreement could not be entered into with that person because they were not of age of majority. And therefore, the parent signed for them and the funds were issued to the parent on behalf of the child for the expenditure on the scholarship. And whether that was correct procedure or not, but that was the way it was handled. And that, as far as I recall, it would have been the explanation for those unusual cases. But I think we are at the position, Mr. Chairman, if I may say so, where I am finding myself really having difficulty in continuing because we are in a situation where I am being asked to respond to things that I have had no opportunity to go back and look at, and 2 years after the fact. It remains the case that I object in the strongest possible terms to the way in which I am described in this report and the shortcomings that are imputed to me without having had an opportunity to do anything or say anything about it. And I don't know that I can usefully continue, sir.
Any other questions? Thank you for coming, sir. We don't have any more questions for you.
Thank you.
I think, Mr. Parchment, I believe you're in the portals. Would you come inside, please? Oh, sorry about that. Thank you, Mr. Parchment, for coming. We apologize for the somewhat confusions at times of when you had to come and when not to come, but you finally got here. We thank you for coming. When you answer the first question, you tell us your full name and what your position was at the time that this report was done. Can you tell us what was your role, if any, in the management or administration of the Nation Building Fund?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, members of the Public Accounts Committee, I'd like to make a statement for the record. My name is Richard Lonnie Parchment, and I currently reside at 22 Bonaventure Road, Northwest Point, West Bay. Having read through the Auditor General's report on the management of the Nation Building Program, I'd like for it to be recorded that the report is very critical of the responsibilities of the former Premier and his Chief of Staff, but I am not mentioned by name, nor is my former position mentioned. I wish to also note for the record that I am not the former Premier, nor was I the Chief of Staff in the office of the Premier. From the 1st of June 2009 until the 31st of May 2013, my job title was that of Chief Political Assistant to the office of the Leader of Government Business / Premier, and my contract was limited to 48 months of service. My only tenure as a civil servant was from 1988 to 1990, when I was a teacher at the middle school. I am not now, nor have I ever been employed as a senior government official, and according to my previous job description, and because of the responsibilities that I was tasked to carry out, the civil service protocols ensured that I was not considered a civil servant. As such, I find it rather ominous that there are no other private citizens in attendance other than myself to discuss their roles in their children receiving a scholarship through the YANBP, or that the current Premier in 2013 chose to publicly name my daughter a minor in this assembly, but not the other 184 students or recipients or the other student athletes attending the same institution she was attending. IMG Academy in Bradenton, Florida is an internationally recognized academic and sports academy. It is considered to be one of the world's best, with the likes of Serena Williams, Cam Newton, and LeBron James, just to name a few of its past alumni. In 2012, the Cayman Islands basketball fraternity had 2 budding female basketball stars who were invited to a summer camp at IMG. They were then offered placements at this institution after their athletic and academic records were evaluated. After receiving and evaluating their applications, these 2 athletes were offered scholarships from the office of the Premier. The initial request to support these 2 student athletes did not come directly from parents, but was submitted by the technical director of basketball and the director of sports. Because of the talent level of these 2 students and their acceptance at this world-class institution, because of my connection to the office, I did not participate in the application process. The Chief of Staff and the Young Nation Builders Coordinator in the office of the Premier had ensured that there was a rigorous application process in place. There was a robust 20-plus page application form, and my participation in this process was to sign where parents had to sign, agreeing to be bonded to the government of the Cayman Islands as my daughter was then a minor. I find it hard to understand how the members of the Legislative Assembly could pass this program into budget year after year and have it go through the scrutiny of Finance Committee, and yet somehow there is absolution to the members but not private citizens. I believe there was failure by the legislators of this country during this process. I find it hard to understand how the Cabinet, including ex officio members, could review and discuss this program in Cabinet, and yet somehow there is absolution to the members, yet it appears as if only the citizens of this country followed incorrect practices. Mr. Chairman, with that being said, I want to end this statement by saying that I was not responsible for any policy development, nor was I tasked with managing policy, and I learned about the majority of the information in this report when I read the Auditor General report after it had been sent to me by this committee. To the best of my knowledge, there were 3 student athletes to the same institution that my daughter attended, have those parents of those students been called to testify before this committee? If no, why? There was, according to the Auditor General report, 185 students who received scholarship funding. Have the parents of those students been called to testify before this committee? If no, why? And I end there, sir.
Well, Mr. Parchman, I think you're taking some liberties in your statement that are not correct.
Okay?
You are not the only private citizen that this committee, as chairman, that has summoned. And we have not summoned you, to my knowledge, about anything to do with your daughter receiving a scholarship.
Oh,
I think it's rather unfortunate that you have recorded all of that unnecessarily into the hands of the House. But that is your prerogative. I don't know whether you're aware of it or not, but we had the chairman of the CPA here 2 weeks ago as a private citizen and his role as a chairman of the CPA. Is it your evidence to this committee that you had no involvement at all in assisting people or others? We're not talking about your family now. Assisting others in getting access to the premier as his, refresh what you say title was again, political consultant?
political assistant.
Political assistant. In none of your 48 months as his political assistant and the duration of this program, were you involved in facilitating any people to get access to the premier to facilitate getting funds from the Nation Building Fund?
That was my responsibility, to get people's access to the premier.
For the Nation Building Fund?
No, never. That might have come along as part of my responsibilities, but not necessarily the nation building fund. My job was to get people's access to the premier.
Okay. But I get back to my question. During that period that this fund existed, were you involved in any way in facilitating people to make presentations, get access to the premier, for them to access funds in the Nation Building Fund?
Mr. Chairman, I might have been involved in transferring letters or requests or applications, but bringing them directly or having interviewed them, no.
Mr. Chairman, I just an overall, I guess, more so question, a question. In terms of your specific role then, can you just describe, even if it was cursory, what your relationship, if any, was with the nation building fund, in both scholarships or in general, the payments to churches, etc. Can you just tell us what role, if any, you had?
Scholar through Chairman, my role in the nation building program and also with the churches was limited to the fact that there were a couple of occasions when I had to call a pastor of a church to tell them that something had been approved, or to notify a parent who the coordinator could not get a hold of that their scholarship had been approved. Other than that, I was not involved in that program.
And I guess that's why I was trying to figure out, whether or not you had any access to decision making, whether you had any kind of role in terms of process review, any of that. So there was none of that. So you basically were just at times a kind of facilitator to the premier in your testimony. You're a facilitator to and from the premier.
Absolutely. And for the record, Mr. Chairman, the report mentions in number 7.2, I'll show what page is on, one case amounting to $66,000. And I'm wondering which case that was, because to the best of my knowledge, the amount for two of those 2 out of the 3 scholarships that went to IMG was actually for $69,000. So either there was a deliberate attempt to isolate the one recipient, or improper investigations happened from the Auditor General's office because there was more than one recipient.
Your evidence is that you
My
know-
knowledge is.
Huh?
My knowledge is.
Your knowledge is that persons got up to $69,000 to go to IMG,
Yes, sir.
and there were 3 people who got those?
There were 2 persons that got that amount, and one other person that got a lesser amount, but to a high degree as well, to a high dollar amount as well.
Do you have any explanation of why 2 would get more? Isn't the fees kind of the same, or
My understanding from the parent was that by the time they applied, it was later on after the one term had already started, and that the amount had been again questioned, and I'm not sure if it was Mr. Leonard or who it was, decided that a lesser amount would be granted for that institution, seeing they already had 2 students there.
does your knowledge allow you to say whether that less amount would cover the person at the school, or?
I'm not sure what it covered, sir.
Well, I guess the short answer, but I'll let the auditor answer, is that they sampled, they didn't pull every application, but, and they pulled samples, and maybe those 2 cases didn't come up in the sample, because they don't audit every single transaction.
No, but they could do that, but the lesser amount was not 66. So that's my point, that it couldn't be that, that was one.
No,
one of the-
but there's no way of knowing from what you see in the report that 66,000 is even related to that school. That could have been a scholarship for somebody else.
Find it hard to believe, but okay.
Well, unless you were involved enough to know that there was not another scholarship at that 60-odd thousand granted to any other institution.
I just made it clear that there were 2 that were for 69,000,
Right,
and
what
there's
I'm
one
saying is
person
that-
for a lesser amount.
And your knowledge is that only that institution got scholarships at that level.
That's the best of my knowledge, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I just kind of looking at 72, and just kind of going back to something that the chairman said earlier. There were 42 cases of payments being in excess of 25,000, right? And they put in the graph there 1.4 million, right? So again, I don't think, especially not from this report, that there were any institutions or specific people being pointed out for that amount, and it could have been any one of those 42 cases out of the I can't remember how many overall scholarships. So certainly, I think to speak from the committee, there was no singling out of anybody in that regard, but the Auditor General can correct if I'm wrong in that instance. He's indicating that I'm correct. I guess, it's, Mr. Parchment, in terms of my line of questioning before on this is, if you didn't have any direct kind of oversight, decision making, etc., I don't have any more questions for you. I think it was more so to understand your role in the Premier's office, because that's where the report said all the decisions were being made at the and Mr. Dilbert also said that other people in the department were making had various oversight roles and responsibilities and assisted in the decision-making process. It wasn't just him and the Premier that were as kind of insinuated by the report.
Mr. Connolly, to the Chairman, there was a young nation-building coordinator and a staff complement that went along. I think a person who was assisting that person and then that tied back into Mr. Dilbert, and I think another. So there were a few people in the decision-making process, my memory.
I do have one question. So you mentioned this young nation builder coordinator.
Yes.
Was that a civil servant?
It was.
It was. Okay.
Any other questions? If not, thank you very much, Mr. Parkman.
Welcome.
Well, I guess that concludes our hearings on these reports, and I'll look forward to spending many hours in the back room trying to write up a report based on the evidence that we had. I want to thank everybody who participated, the finance and the accountant general, you call now, that's a big title, and the audit office, and the members of the committee. I want to thank you all for coming and taking part and preparing yourself for the questions and everything else. And can I suggest that we meet 2 weeks, 3 weeks from today, from Wednesday? Yeah. Yeah. Let's say we meet the third Wednesday in April, and I'll try to have some draft reports at that time for us to discuss. Okay. So. On what date? 25th. There will be a bill for, yeah. Because I would love to get the reports ready for that meeting. They don't have to be ready for the 25th, but during that meeting. So thank you all very much, and everybody have a good Easter. Overcrowd my district.